Welcome to the deep dive, where we take you on a journey through some really fascinating and complex cases.
Oh, absolutely.
Today, we're diving into the heart of a story that really gripped the Bay Area back in 1984,
hmm
the disappearance and death of Roberta B.B. Lee.
It's a case that raises as many questions as it answers, even after all these years.
Exactly. B.B. was a UC Berkeley student,
Right.
a runner, someone with a bright future ahead of her,
Yeah.
and then she vanishes.
Just like that.
After a morning run with her boyfriend Brad and a friend Robin in Redwood Regional Park.
Redwood Regional Park, yeah.
It's a case that really captures the imagination, doesn't it?
It really does.
A young woman, a seemingly ordinary day, and then poof, gone without a trace.
What's particularly intriguing about this case is the initial mystery. For weeks, there was no sign of BB, just a growing sense of dread and a massive search effort that seemed to hit dead end after dead end.
So let's start by going back to the beginning. The morning of November 3rd, 1984, BB, Brad, and Robin set out for their run in Redwood Regional Park.
Familiar route for them.
A familiar route for them.
Hmm.
It seemed like just another Saturday morning.
But about 2.5 miles in, things take a turn. BB decides to run ahead of Brad and Robin, veering off on her own.
And here's where the first layer of mystery unfolds. Brad and Robin don't seem overly concerned at first. They finish their run, arrive at the parking lot, and BB isn't there.
Now, you might be thinking, wouldn't they immediately panic?
Right.
But according to Brad, BB had been stressed about school lately, so maybe they initially thought she just needed some space, a moment to herself.
It's a bit strange, though, right? To just leave without making absolutely sure she was okay.
It's definitely a decision that raised eyebrows later on.
Yeah.
Brad did drive around for a bit, calling BB's name while Robin waited at the trail entrance, but eventually they left the park without her, assuming she'd find her way home.
But why would they assume that? Did they think she'd just hitchhike home? It seems pretty unlikely, especially for someone who was supposedly stressed and potentially upset.
Well, this was the early 80s. Hitchhiking wasn't as uncommon then as it is now.
True.
And Brad later claimed that BB had done something similar before. After an argument, she had taken off on her own and eventually made her way back.
So he thought she was capable of taking care of herself. But Baby's roommates weren't buying it. When they couldn't reach her, they started calling hospitals and police departments. They knew something was seriously wrong.
And by 2:00 a.m., they contacted Brad again. He finally agreed to come over, and together they decided to file a missing persons report first thing in the morning.
Thankfully, the police took the case seriously right away. They launched a full-scale search for BB, bringing in resources like search dogs, horses, and even helicopters.
One of the searchers, Ilar Nashi, focused on interviewing Brad, trying to understand his relationship with BB and gather any information that might help locate her.
But there's something about Brad's behavior that starts to raise red flags. He seems almost indifferent to the search efforts, more interested in a football game on TV than in finding his missing girlfriend.
And to add to the growing unease, Brad's story begins to shift. He changes his account of where he last saw BB, making the search efforts even more difficult.
And then he starts suggesting these wild theories. Maybe BB hiked miles away to Mount Diablo, or maybe she was kidnapped and forced into slave labor. It's hard to reconcile these far-fetched scenarios with the image of a concerned boyfriend desperately searching for his missing girlfriend.
Those inconsistencies and outlandish theories definitely cast a shadow of suspicion over Brad. But for the time being, the focus remained on finding BB.
Despite their best efforts, the search teams came up empty-handed. The dogs picked up BB's scent for a short distance, but then lost it. It was a frustrating dead end.
But then a few days into the investigation, a woman contacts the police with a chilling tip. She claims to have seen a man dragging a young woman who looked a lot like BB towards a golden brownish Dodge van near the walking trail.
This witness was able to provide a detailed description of the man. White, tall, heavyset, light brown hair, about 40 or 45 years old. She even remembered specific details about the van, including a dent on the driver's side.
This tip injects new urgency into the investigation. The police create a composite sketch of the man and even film a dramatization of the potential abduction for news broadcasts. Suddenly, the focus shifts to a possible abduction.
It seems like they're finally zeroing in on a solid lead. Could this be the break they've been waiting for?
Unfortunately, even with this new information and increased media attention, the case remained unsolved. And all the while, BB's friends and family are tirelessly searching for her, holding on to hope that she'll be found safe.
They form a group called the Friends of BB Lee, put up posters, conduct independent searches, and even set up a headquarters to receive tips. It's heartbreaking to see their determination in the face of such agonizing uncertainty.
And then, 5 weeks after BB's disappearance, there's a major development that changes everything. A search dog with the Bay Area Mountain Rescue Unit leads searchers to a cluster of bushes just off the road where Brad claimed he had driven while looking for BB.
Okay.
And there, hidden in those bushes, partially covered with dirt and pine needles, they find BB's body.
The discovery is both a relief and a tragedy. BB's family finally has answers, but those answers come at a devastating cost. It's a moment that marks a turning point in the case.
The location where BB's body was found adds another layer of intrigue to this already perplexing case. It was only about 700 feet from where Brad and Robin last saw her.
How could she have been there all along, so close and yet undiscovered for weeks? It just doesn't make sense.
Adding to the mystery, it was later revealed that a search dog had actually alerted to that same area on the very first day of the search.
Wait, what? Are you saying they could have found her on day one?
It's possible. The dog's handler testified that the dog had pawed at the ground near where BB's body was eventually found. But that wasn't the signal the dog was trained to give for a human remains alert.
So they just, missed her?
It seems almost impossible.
Yeah.
It's a detail that has haunted the case ever since. Did they miss a crucial opportunity to find BB sooner? Or was BB's body not there on that first day?
These are questions that linger even now, adding to the complexity of the case. But with the discovery of BB's body, the focus of the investigation shifts dramatically.
The missing person case becomes a homicide investigation, and the police immediately turn their attention to the last people to see BB alive, Brad and Robin. And while Robin's testimony would come into play later, the initial focus of the investigation was on Brad. His interview with the police started just hours after BB's body was discovered, and it was a tense and grueling affair.
So we have this intense interrogation taking place. What was Brad's initial reaction to the discovery of BB's body?
At first, Brad maintained his innocence. He claimed that his relationship with BB was fine, that she wasn't upset that morning, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He painted a picture of a loving boyfriend who was devastated by the loss of his girlfriend.
But the police weren't entirely convinced by his story, were they? They must have had some reason to suspect him.
Well, there were those inconsistencies in his earlier statements. The shifting accounts of where he last saw BB, the wild theories about her disappearance, those things certainly raised red flags.
And then there was that polygraph test. Didn't that play a crucial role in the interrogation?
Absolutely. The polygraph, or lie detector test, as it's often called, became a central point of contention in this case. Brad agreed to take the test, and the results were, to put it mildly, inconclusive.
Inconclusive. What does that mean exactly? Didn't it either prove he was lying or telling the truth?
It's not quite that simple. Polygraph tests measure physiological responses like heart rate, blood pressure, and perspiration. The theory is that when someone lies, these responses will spike, indicating deception. But interpreting those results is more of an art than a science, and in Brad's case, the results were open to interpretation.
So some of his responses suggested he might be lying, but it wasn't definitive proof.
Exactly. There were a couple of questions where he showed signs of deception, particularly when asked if he had injured BB, but the results weren't clear-cut enough to be used as concrete evidence.
But it must have put even more pressure on Brad, knowing that the police suspected him, that the polygraph results weren't in his favor.
During the third round of questioning, Brad had an emotional breakdown. He was wailing, burying his head in his hands, but according to the examiner, there were no tears. This behavior, coupled with the inconclusive polygraph results, only heightened the investigators' suspicions.
So they started to push harder, using different interrogation tactics to try and get a confession out of him.
Right. They suggested that maybe he'd blacked out and couldn't remember what happened, the classic amnesia defense. They even went so far as to tell him that his fingerprints were found at the crime scene, which we later find out was a lie. It's a tactic that has been used in countless interrogations, sometimes with devastating consequences.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it? The idea that someone could be pressured into confessing to a crime they didn't commit.
It raises serious questions about the ethics of interrogation techniques and the potential for false confessions. But in this case, it seemed to have the desired effect. Brad, under immense pressure, feeling guilty, and perhaps even starting to believe he might have blacked out, finally cracked.
He confessed to killing BB.
He confessed, but his confession was riddled with inconsistencies. He described a scenario where he saw BB running toward him, led her away from the road, and then in a fit of rage backhanded her, causing her to fall and hit her head. He claimed to have used a blanket from his car to move Bibi's body and a hubcap to cover her with dirt.
But none of those details matched up with the evidence found at the crime scene.
The blanket and the hubcap couldn't be linked to the crime. And even more importantly, the pathologist who conducted Bibi's autopsy testified that the severity of her skull fractures couldn't have been caused by a simple fall. It would have taken a much more forceful blow to inflict that kind of injury.
So Brad's confession, while dramatic, was ultimately unreliable. It didn't align with the physical evidence, and it raised even more questions about what truly happened that day.
And to make matters even more complicated, shortly after confessing, Brad recanted his entire story.
What?
He claimed that he only confessed because he was confused, afraid, and being pressured by the police. He said they threatened him with jail time if he couldn't remember what happened, and that they manipulated his guilt over not being able to help Bibi.
So now the investigation had a confession that was being disputed, physical evidence that didn't fully support the confession, and a suspect who's adamant that he was innocent. It was a tangled web of conflicting accounts and uncertain evidence.
And that tangled web only became more intricate as the case moved to trial.
The trial for Bibi Lee's murder began in April of 1986, and it was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and supporters of both Bibi and Brad. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable.
The trial lasted for 27 days, and it was a legal battleground where the prosecution and the defense presented their versions of events, each side trying to convince the jury of their respective narratives.
Let's break down some of the key arguments and testimonies that shaped the trial. We know that Robin, the friend who was with Bibi and Brad that morning, testified. What was her account of the events?
Robin's testimony was a crucial piece of the puzzle. She confirmed that Bibi was indeed upset with Brad that day and that the mood was tense. She admitted that it was her idea for Brad to drive around looking for Bibi while she waited at the parking lot. However, she claimed that she didn't notice any signs of a struggle on Brad when he returned, and that his demeanor wasn't particularly alarming.
So her testimony seemed to support Brad's claim that nothing out of the ordinary had happened during the run.
But there was a catch. During a pre-trial hearing for the defense, Robin had stated that she didn't notice any change in Brad's behavior after he supposedly killed Bibi, but at the trial, she suggested that he seemed a bit more worried and quieter.
So her story changed slightly. Why do you think that is?
It's hard to say for sure. Perhaps she was nervous, or maybe her memory of the events had shifted over time. Or maybe she was trying to protect Brad, consciously or subconsciously. Whatever the reason, the discrepancy in her testimonies provided the defense with an opportunity to raise doubt about her reliability as a witness.
The defense also focused heavily on the search efforts and the lack of physical evidence linking Brad to the crime. They argued that searchers, including bloodhounds, were incredibly close to where Bibi's body was eventually found but didn't detect her scent. How is that even possible?
It's a compelling argument. The defense pointed out that the dogs had even picked up Bibi's scent in the area where the witness claimed to have seen the man with the van, but then the scent vanished. It's as if Bibi had gotten into a vehicle.
So they were suggesting that the abduction theory was more plausible than the prosecution's case against Brad.
Exactly. They argued that the police had tunnel vision, focusing on Brad and ignoring other potential leads like the man in the van.
But what about the fact that Bibi's body was found so close to where she was last seen with Brad and Robin? Wouldn't that suggest that Brad was involved?
The prosecution tried to explain this away by suggesting that the dogs might have confused Bibi's scent with that of her family members who had joined the search efforts. But that explanation seemed a bit far-fetched to some.
Yeah, I've never heard of search dogs getting confused like that.
And, adding to the confusion, one of the searchers who had been present on the first day of the search came forward during the trial with a surprising revelation.
Uh-oh.
He testified that his dog had actually led him to the exact spot where Bibi's body was later found. The dog had pawed at the ground, but that wasn't the signal it was trained to give for a human remains alert.
So they potentially could have found Bibi on the very first day.
It's possible. The searcher admitted that he didn't report this incident because he was embarrassed to admit that he or his dog had made a mistake. It was only during the trial, years later, that he felt compelled to share this information.
It's amazing how a simple oversight like that could have such a profound impact on the investigation. It just adds another layer of doubt and uncertainty to the whole case.
And the lack of definitive physical evidence became a central point of contention during the trial. The two rocks collected near Bibi's body had no DNA on them. The blanket and hubcap that Brad claimed to have used couldn't be connected to the crime either. And due to the decomposition of Bibi's body, it was impossible to determine if she had been sexually assaulted.
So there was basically nothing concrete tying Brad to the murder except for his confession, which he later recanted.
And that's where things got really complicated. The prosecution maintained that they hadn't fed Brad any details about the crime scene and that his confession was genuine because he was able to provide specific information that only the killer would know.
But the defense argued that Brad had learned these details through the grapevine.
Right. They claimed that when the police notified the Friends of Bibi Lee headquarters about the discovery of her body, they had divulged information about the location, condition, and clothing, and that Brad, who was present at the headquarters, had overheard these details.
But there were conflicting accounts about what exactly was said during that phone call.
Right. Some volunteers testified that they were only told that Bibi's body had been found, with no specifics. Others recalled discussions about the possibility of identifying a decomposed body, but they insisted it was speculation, not concrete information. It became a he said, she said situation.
So it was impossible to know for sure whether Brad had gleaned crucial details about the crime scene before confessing.
Exactly. And the defense also raised serious concerns about the validity of Brad's confession. They argued that he had been coerced and manipulated by the police during a lengthy and grueling interrogation.
They even brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Brad was experiencing mental fatigue and was susceptible to suggestion due to the coercive tactics used by the police.
And remember that polygraph test? Well, the defense argued that it had been improperly administered and that the results were unreliable. They even brought in a renowned polygraph expert, Cleve Baxter, who testified that the examiner had misread some of the results and that Brad's responses weren't actually indicative of deception.
So even the polygraph, which the prosecution was leaning on as evidence of Brad's guilt, became a point of contention.
And then, to add another layer of complexity to the case, Brad himself took the stand in his own defense.
You don't see that very often in murder trials. Why do you think he decided to testify?
Perhaps he felt it was his only chance to directly address the jury and plead his innocence. Or maybe he wanted to counter the negative portrayal of him that had emerged throughout the trial.
Whatever the reason, it was a risky move.
And during his testimony, Brad stuck to his story about being threatened with jail time and manipulated into confessing. He claimed that he had genuinely believed he had blacked out and committed the murder because the police had convinced him of it.
It's a fascinating psychological aspect of the case. The power of suggestion, the pressure of interrogation, and the vulnerability of a suspect who wants to believe he's innocent.
And to further support Brad's claims of coercion, the defense called witnesses who testified that Brad had been actively involved in the search for Bibi and hadn't exhibited any suspicious behavior.
They also presented testimony from people who had seen Brad at various times during the evening that Bibi's body was supposedly moved. This was to challenge the prosecution's timeline of events and to raise doubt about whether Brad had the opportunity to commit the murder.
The prosecution countered these arguments by highlighting some of Brad's more unusual behaviors during the weeks following Bibi's disappearance.
Like what?
Well, witnesses testified that Brad had been sleeping in Bibi's room, wearing her clothes and using her makeup. They also pointed to a poem he had written titled Suitable Ending, which they interpreted as a veiled confession of guilt.
But Brad offered alternative explanations for these behaviors.
He claimed that he was simply distraught over Bibi's disappearance and was trying to feel close to her by surrounding himself with her belongings. And he explained that the poem was about the witness who had seen the man with a van but hadn't intervened, not about his own guilt.
So even seemingly incriminating behaviors were open to interpretation.
Right, and the timeline of events, particularly on the night Bibi's body was supposedly moved, became a crucial point of debate. The prosecution presented their estimated timeline, suggesting that Brad had a window of opportunity to commit the murder and dispose of the body. But the defense presented conflicting testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen Brad at various locations during that time, making it difficult to definitively place him at the crime scene.
It sounds like the prosecution's case was crumbling under the weight of inconsistencies and conflicting accounts.
And ultimately, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury deadlocked on the murder charges. The judge, rather than declaring a mistrial, instructed the jury to consider the lesser charge of manslaughter.
Wow, so they essentially acknowledged that the evidence wasn't strong enough to convict Brad of murder.
But even on the manslaughter charge, the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. They were deadlocked again, this time 8-4 in favor of conviction. The judge finally declared a mistrial.
It's fascinating that despite all the time, effort, and evidence presented, the jury couldn't definitively say whether Brad was guilty or not.
And some of the jurors who spoke to the media after the trial expressed their doubts about the thoroughness of the police investigation and the lack of conclusive physical evidence.
They felt that there were simply too many unanswered questions to convict Brad beyond a reasonable doubt.
But even though the first trial ended in a mistrial, Brad wasn't completely off the hook.
The prosecution decided to retry him for voluntary manslaughter.
Unfortunately, there's not much information available about the second trial. It seems like it was a much lower profile affair with no new evidence presented.
And the outcome.
Brad was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 6 years in state prison. However, he remained free on bail pending an appeal.
And what happened with the appeal?
His conviction was upheld in 1991, but in a rather surprising turn of events, he only ended up serving 2 years and 8 months of his sentence. He was released in February of 1995.
Wow, that's a significantly reduced sentence.
And despite the controversy surrounding the case, it seemed like Brad had managed to move on with his life.
But then there's this strange incident in New Zealand a few years later.
Right. In 2002, Brad was arrested for indecent exposure. The details of the incident are a bit murky, but it seems to have involved him exposing himself to a woman while hiking. It's an unsettling detail that further complicates our understanding of Brad.
It's definitely something that raises eyebrows and makes you wonder if there's more to the story than we know.
And while Brad's legal troubles seem to have ended there, the mystery surrounding Bibi Lee's death continues to linger.
Bibi's family maintained their belief that Brad was responsible for her murder and even filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him. But the outcome of that lawsuit remains unclear.
And as the years have passed, new theories and possibilities have emerged. Some people have suggested that Bibi might have been a victim of Michael Patrick Ide, a serial killer who was active in the Bay Area during the time of her disappearance.
The witness's description of the man with the van does bear a resemblance to Ide.
Right, and although the police have dismissed the connection as circumstantial, it's a possibility that some find compelling.
It's just another reminder that even in cases that seem closed, there can be lingering doubts and unanswered questions.
And in the case of Bibi Lee, those doubts have persisted for decades, fueled by conflicting evidence, a controversial confession, and the enduring mystery of what truly happened on that fateful morning run in Redwood Regional Park.
So we've been through a lot of information about this case. What are your final thoughts? Are we any closer to understanding what truly happened to Bibi Lee?
That's the question that lingers, isn't it? We've examined the evidence, the testimonies, the conflicting accounts, the lingering doubts. And I think it's safe to say that this case defies easy answers.
We have Brad's confession, which, despite its inconsistencies, is a significant piece of the puzzle. It's hard to ignore a confession, even one that's later recanted.
Absolutely. But we also have to consider the possibility that his confession was coerced. You know, the interrogation techniques used by the police were questionable, to say the least. And the psychological pressure he was under was immense. Imagine being interrogated for hours, being told you might have blacked out, being told your fingerprints were found at the crime scene, even though they weren't.
Yeah. It's easy to see how someone, especially someone young and perhaps naive, could crack under that kind of pressure.
Right.
And then there's the lack of physical evidence directly linking Brad to the crime. The blanket, the hubcap, the rocks, none of it could definitively place him at the scene.
And the timeline is murky at best. There are gaps in Brad's whereabouts, but there are also witnesses who place him elsewhere during the crucial time frame. It's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, and some that don't quite fit. You can see the general outline, but the full picture remains elusive.
And let's not forget about the man in the van. That initial witness account was never fully explained, and the possibility of a random abduction can't be entirely ruled out.
Especially when you consider that a potential serial killer, Michael Patrick Ide, was active in the area at the time and matched the witness's description.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it, that Bibi might have been the victim of a predator who was never brought to justice for her murder.
Yeah, it's a possibility that can't be ignored, and it raises even more questions about the thoroughness of the original investigation. Did they focus too intently on Brad and dismiss other leads too quickly?
It makes you wonder if Bibi's case is truly closed or if it remains, at least in part, unsolved.
It's a question that continues to haunt this case, and it speaks to the complexities of seeking justice in the face of uncertainty.
What do we take away from all of this? What lessons can we learn from the disappearance and death of Bibi Lee?
Well, I think this case highlights the importance of thorough, unbiased investigation. It underscores the dangers of tunnel vision and the need to consider all possibilities, even the uncomfortable ones. It reminds us that sometimes, even after trials, convictions, and years gone by, the truth can remain elusive.
We may never know for certain what happened to BB Lee on that fateful morning run, but her story serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of mystery.
And it compels us to keep asking questions, seeking answers, and demanding accountability, even in the face of uncertainty. The pursuit of justice is a vital part of honoring the memory of victims like BB Lee.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the BB Lee case. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and perhaps even a little bit haunting. We'll leave you with this. If Brad wasn't responsible for BB's death, does that mean her case is still open? What implications does that hold for the safety of women in that area and the potential for other unsolved crimes? It's something to ponder as we continue to grapple with the complexities of this tragic case.